Good evening and welcome. My name is Jacqueline Baba and I direct the University Committee on Human Rights Studies, and I'm delighted to be here with all of you this evening. At the start of this academic year, we launched a year-long seminar on human rights and the war on terrorism. At the time, at the beginning of the year, we were principally concerned with domestic issues, both in the US and in European countries, because the situation at Guantanamo, which of course is still very much a topical concern, anti-terrorist laws, immigration exclusions, administrative detentions, and the rapidly shifting balance between civil liberties and national security concerns. Since the time of that launch, we've had a series of events all concerned with aspects of this balance between security and rights in Western countries. And we've hosted prominent advocates, lobbyists, and politicians, most recently David Blunkett, the British Home Secretary. But of course, this concern with domestic issues in Western countries has been closely linked to concern with the implications further afield. And we have been concerned throughout the year with the use of torture by close allies of the US, the increasingly close collaboration between law enforcement, border control, and intelligence services, which has had the effect of criminalizing much immigration and stigmatizing many communities and jeopardizing the family life and security of many communities. As the year has progressed, our topic has seemed to become more and more relevant, to the point where today, of course, it is a burning issue. Today, we're confronted with a situation of just about all-out warfare in Iraq, with serious casualties and fatalities amongst civilians and combatants across nationalities. We face a situation in Afghanistan where the promise of democratization and empowerment for women seems extremely remote. And we see extremely serious situation in other parts of the Middle East, of course, in Palestine, in the West Bank, and in Gaza. We see the prospect of terrorism in different states just about every day, Madrid, Riyadh, and so on. The list goes on and on. In this context of danger, of threat, of human rights violations, it's the courage of individuals who speak out against arbitrary rule, against wholesale violation of rights, that plays a critical and important role, an invaluable public function, a function that goes to the heart of the mission of Harvard and of the Kennedy School that President Summers spoke about yesterday in this very forum, when he said that the role of many of us, we feel, is to make the world a better place in some respects. So today we are extremely fortunate to have with us someone who really has done just this, someone who's had the courage over decades to speak out in the face of abuse of power, who has paid dearly in personal terms for his courage, but who still stands as an example. And most specifically in this context, he stands as an example, as an intellectual who is not hidden behind the ivory tower, but has gone out taking his scholarship to issues of concern in the wider community. He is, and he may continue to be, what we at Harvard have called a scholar at risk, someone who faces persecution because of his ideas, but also because he lives in a situation of danger, and who's had the intellectual honesty to turn his authority into a beacon for demands. Professor Saad Eddin Ibrahim is one of the leading public intellectuals in the Arab world. He's a professor of sociology at the American University of Cairo, and he has worked and published on a very wide range of topics, including issues related to democracy, religion, conflict, and social structure in the Arab world, particularly in Egypt. His books include Egypt, Islam and Democracy, a study of Egypt's armed Islamists, The Sociology of the Arab-Israeli Conflict, and the widely acclaimed text, Arab Society, Social Science Perspectives. His scholarly work has placed him at the forefront of intellectual debate on matters relating to democratization and Islam in the Middle East. In addition to this scholarly output, however, Professor Ibrahim has also been a highly visible human rights spokesperson. He is the chairman of the board of the Ibn Khaldun Center for Development Studies and an advisor to Secretary General Kofi Annan. He's also the former Secretary General of the Arab Organization for Human Rights, a board member of Transparency International and of the Minority Rights Group, which some of you will know has done wonderful work publishing information about minority groups, including in the Middle East. He came to worldwide attention and repeatedly to the front pages of the New York Times, as some of you may well recall, in the year 2000, when he was imprisoned and tried in Egypt on charges I've just lost my place. On charges which were widely denounced as being politically motivated. He was arrested in June 2000, convicted and sentenced to 7 years in imprisonment for allegedly defaming Egypt and misappropriating European Commission funds. After 17 months in jail, he was eventually acquitted by Egypt's highest court of all the charges, and he was released. By then, he had had extensive exposure to the inside of Egyptian prisons. My most vivid memory of my last conversation with Professor Ibrahim was about his time in prison, when he didn't bemoan his own conditions and the hardship that he and his family had faced, but he told me about the extremely serious conditions of young Muslim Islamists detained indefinitely who had no access to outside supporters and campaigns the way he did. And I was very struck by this sense of empathy that he felt for people who he probably quite violently disagreed with. So this was, I think, a hallmark of the sort of positions he's taken. So it is really a great pleasure to host Professor Ibrahim today and to invite him to deliver his lecture on democracy, autocracy, and terrorism in the Middle East. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ibrahim.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Jacqueline, for this very warm and generous introduction. Thank you all for coming to share this evening in such a beautiful day. It must be a great sacrifice for you to be indoor, but it's a pleasure to be here. Being in this place brings back memories. Memories from the 1960s. When I was a student activist, like all my generation, we had some of the most vibrant chapters of the Arab students in Harvard, MIT, in Boston U. And I happened to be a president of the Arab students in America, and I came often to the Boston area to be with some of the fellow Arab students who became also very involved in all the great movements of the 60s, the anti-war movement, the civil rights movements, the women's movements, the environmental movements. And it's these three movements that shaped the consciousness of my generation in the 60s. Much of what I learned on those years would remain with me. For so many years afterwards, kept me very committed to what I was committed to in the 1960s, even though I have grown older, I've become a husband, a father, a grandfather. But those principles, the ideals that my generation harbored in the 60s remained with me. And when I went back to Egypt, to the Arab world, I felt that I have to reinvent myself and to work for my society, for my nation, probably more vigorously than I ever even did when I was a student here in the 60s. Our region, as you all know, as Jackie had just mentioned, has been bedeviled by so much wars, armed conflicts, civil strife. we had more than our share of all of these. And we have had also more than our share of dictatorships. And the two, armed conflict, civil strife, misery, underdevelopment on one hand, dictatorship on the other hand, are two sides of the same coin. And that immediately defined my agenda when I went back in 1975. An agenda that will take me from an intellectual researcher to an activist, and ultimately put me in conflict with the state, with my state, with all the regimes like my regime in Egypt, and landed me in prison, series of allegations, trials, imprisonment. It's all connected. All of these passed through my mind as I was crossing the Harvard Square or coming from the Charles to this place. Came back lively, and it just makes you, especially I'm addressing this to young people, never to give up an idea or an ideal because of adversity. Our world will never become a better place unless there are some of you that will carry on that fight, no matter what. The title, thank you. The title of my talk and of this series is about human rights, terrorism, and autocracy. And all of these categories are interlinked. Let me suggest a negative turn that saddened me, saddened all the human rights activists around the world. At the time when we all thought that democracy and the human rights is about to make its final victory march, the last stage of victory, around the turn of the century. By that time, by the year 2000, the Soviet bloc has already disintegrated. The third wave of democracy has already been 25 years old, having started in Portugal in 1975, followed by Spain the year after, followed by Greece the year after, followed by Latin America the decade after, followed by East Asia, Philippines and Marcos and Korea and all of these countries, followed by the Eastern Bloc, followed by the demise of communism and the end of totalitarianism. Also, we had been already into our second half of century of human rights, conventions, treaties, accords, the first being 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So there was something in the air that we are very close to a final victory. It is exactly at this time that 9/11 happened. And 9/11 set back this march of democracy and human rights. It set it back several years. And it is this discovery, witnessing it lively, that anguished many of us who thought at the end of their life, they have something to show. All of a sudden, 9/11 happens. People like myself and my colleagues get arrested. It darkened. And I assure you, 9/11 had as much saddening impact on me and my colleagues as the fact that we were already in prison. because we could see the negative implication of something as horrific as 9/11 could have. Let me share with you just a personal side episode on the subject. It was about 4 o'clock on 9/11 when my cell in the notorious Torah prison opened and the guards ushered me out. Very unlikely time to open my cell and to be ordered out. Very quickly, they marched me out of my cell block all the way to the prison administration building. Again, asking the guard, where are you taking me? Why at this time? The guard had no idea of why they were taking me, why they were ordering me, where I was to go. Anyhow, the minute I entered the building, and then I was ushered into a big hall like this, where the officers of the prison were all sitting with the television on, with CNN on, and with the narration, and with the sight of the two towers that you must have seen hundreds of times since then, in front of me on the stage, on the screen. And since the narration was in English, and many of these officers did not really know much languages, let alone English, they remembered that one of the inmates knows English. So they sent for him to be the interpreter, to translate what's going on, to make sense of this, that obviously, even without knowing exactly the language, but they could tell that something horrific was happening, something on unprecedented scale, so they wanted to know the detail. So anyhow, they invited me to translate. I did for about 10, 15 minutes. And then all of a sudden, not only was the scene in itself riveting and anguishing, but I remembered all of a sudden that my wife was in New York, was few blocks from that World Trade Center. And for all practical purposes, she could have been in that center. She had many friends who were working there. And all of a sudden, I found myself taken by the thought that she could be there. So here I was in prison, and an event happening on the other side of the world, in its own right, dramatic and tragic, but also on a personal level, could impact a person of my family, my wife. And to make things worse, I suddenly remembered that on that day, my daughter was flying from Egypt to New York to join her mother. I forgot the occasion, but probably they were to receive something on my behalf since I was in prison, one of those awards that are often given to prisoners of conscience. And they were flying to New York to receive it on my behalf. So all of a sudden, what was to be a joyful occasion on my behalf in New York could have turned into another family tragedy, as if my imprisonment was not enough. So I couldn't help it. Tears began to just come out of my eyes. And the officers could not comprehend. They thought it was just a scene. I couldn't tell them that my wife and my daughter are in New York. Anyhow, they ushered me back, ordered me back to my cell after they learned and heard my interpretation of what was going on. and whom I thought who did it. They were very curious about that. Anyhow, I had 2 sleepless nights in my cell, wondering about what happened to my family. No way to know, since I was in prison. Sleepless nights, 2 sleepless nights, adding to my imprisonment, the anguish. And all of a sudden, all your little world, from your cell, all the way to the World Trade Center, all the way to the rest of the world, all become one entity, all interconnected. How our personal biography could intersect so much with global events in ways that we had never thought possible 10 years earlier or 15 years earlier, or in the earlier years when I was a student activist in the 60s here. Anyhow, that event was one more turning point. So many turning points, and this was definitely one of them, because it will usher one of the most interesting, fascinating dialogues in prison between me and the Islamicists in prison. To give you an idea, in my particular prison, there were 500 inmates, 300 of which were Islamists, 3 different groups of Islamists. And they were as curious as the officers the day before or the 2 days before of what was happening, especially when fingers began to point at Islam and Muslims. And the first reaction was, it couldn't be us. It couldn't be Muslims. Muslims could not and should not have committed anything like that. It must be, and here you begin to get face-to-face an exposure to conspiracy theory. If it was not Muslims, who could it be? It must be the CIA. It must be the FBI. It must be the Mossad. Doing all of this in order to pin it on Muslims, in order to justify further invasion and further humiliation of Muslims and Islam. That was the first reaction in prison. After the shock, that was the first analytical reaction. What would that do to Islam and Muslims? That became part of an ongoing debate. Some of them who were more honest and who did not dismiss the possibility that it could be fellow Muslim activists began to think of the ramification in the long run. And part of this thinking would contribute to a great deal of revision of their thoughts and practices, revisions and practices that will culminate in these Islamicists in prison issuing 4 books, 4 very important books, basically deploring the use of violence, declaring that they were wrong when they used the violence before they ended up in prison, calling on their fellow Muslims outside, especially Muslim activists, never to commit the same mistakes that they did. In order to give you an idea, some of these Islamic militants in prison had been implicated in series of cases in the 70s and 80s and 90s, including those who assassinated President Sadat back in 1981. People I have visited actually as a researcher, and then I ended up some 20 years later joining them as a fellow inmate. So I knew quite a few of them, and that facilitated the dialogue. And part of the dialogue was their observation of why the world made so much fuss about me and my colleagues in Ibn Khaldun Center, there were 27 associates from Ibn Khaldun Center who were arrested and incarcerated with me. So the Islamists were saying basically, well, there are 27 of you, but there are 15,000 of us in prison, in this prison and in neighboring prisons. Why hasn't the world lifted a finger on our behalf and made all this fuss about you and your colleagues? In trying to answer this question, we opened the gates for ijtihad. They began to truly go back in their own beliefs, convictions, as well as on their practices. And soul-searching began. Part of my answer to their inquiry of why the world made so much about me and not about them was that I am perceived, me and my center, the Ibn Khaldun Center, my colleagues, we are perceived as sharing core universal values with many human rights groups around the world. And that's why they took an interest in our case. And that's why they are speaking on our behalf. So they came back in another round of the dialogue, said, but we share these values too. I said, if you share these values, you have failed to communicate this commitment to the world outside. The world outside thinks of you as violent, intolerant, bigoted, violent, and 9/11 is the last episode. I said, oh, but we condemn 9/11. We are not like that. I said, well, but that is your image outside. I said, how do we change this image? I said, you change the image by first changing your behavior, your action. Second, by renouncing violence and bigotism and intolerance, and by highlighting your commitment to the values that the world has grown to respect. They said, yes, we can do that. We can renounce, we can write, but we could not show that we have changed behaviorally so long as we are prisoners. That has to wait until we get out of prison. I said, fine, it can wait, but at least write and make that these writings known to the world outside, which they did, by the way. 4 volumes were issued by the Islamists in prison, and I had a little part or credit into encouraging them to do that. And it's very important that even people who have done atrocious things at one phase of their life have come around to recognize the dead end, the negative ramification of what they did. And in a way, they consider themselves partly responsible for 9/11. Why? Because this is the 3rd generation of Islamic militants who did 9/11. And they realized that these guys who did 9/11 could not have done it without having used them as role models. So in that sense, they felt partly responsible, which was good. And one of the volumes actually is on 9/11, their own reflection on 9/11. Very important. Anyhow, this is part of what I wanted to share with you. The other part is what happened in this country as a result of 9/11. Understandable, the shock, the horror that 9/11 has caused Americans was probably compounded by the fact that this is the strongest, the richest country in the world and in history. So to be so vulnerable to a score of zealots, whatever religion they belong to, that is understandably must, and it did shake America. And it made it possible. It made it actually imperative for the President of the United States and for this administration to take all the necessary measures to safeguard the security of this country, of these people, which is the duty, the obligation of any government. But what after the shock, the day after, the year after, what has these draconian measures done to the cause of human rights? And that's what I would like to devote my last few minutes to. It did three things. One, it gave our dictators a pretext to increase their repression. As a matter of fact, one dictator after another almost took a secret delight in what happened to America, because before 9/11, many of them were reprimanded frequently by the State Department, by Congress, for being repressive, for passing emergency laws, for resorting to all kind of, administrative detention, as Jackie mentioned, to all of these emergency laws, special exceptional security courts, all of these they were reprimanded for. Now, with the Patriot Act, with the home security measures, they said, look, when national security or internal security was threatened in the United States, they did exactly what we had done before, and the Americans now could no longer tell us, stop this or stop that. So here is one thing that compounded our anguish. As if the tragedy was not enough, but what America resorted to in times, in moments of need, which was understandable, fully understandable, was abused or used, manipulated by dictators around the world to increase or to compound their repressive measures. Two, America can no longer occupy and stay on the moral high ground for defense of human rights and basic freedoms. They couldn't continue to do that so long as these draconian measures remain in place. This awareness led former President Jimmy Carter to convene a conference in Atlanta last November and to invite human rights defenders from around the world. 43 countries, from China to Argentina, were represented in that conference. All of them, all of the participants, were human rights defenders who, like myself, have been either subject to imprisonment or to torture or to exile, to some of these measures in their own countries. And they were giving testimonies of what 9/11 and what followed 9/11 have done to the cause of human rights in their communities. And one testimony after another, 43 countries, all echoed the same remarks I just made, that it has worsened the situation for them. It has robbed them off vis-a-vis their own regimes, vis-a-vis their own local domestic dictators, of the kind of support they used to get from the West, from the United States, from human rights activists in America in their fight. Now they had to duck down and to take almost a more timid approach in confronting their regimes. What we concluded in Atlanta, and I invite you to visit the Atlanta Center website and to read what we issued at the end of 3 days of deliberation. What we issued after 3 days was something we called the Atlanta Declaration. in which we expressed our appreciation, our understanding of how a responsible, democratically elected government must do in a moment of crisis like 9/11. However, we had to remind governments like that of the United States, a democratic government, that the implication of what they are doing here has echoes around the world, and some of these echoes are quite negative, or at least they are reframed by local dictators in a self-serving manner to justify their continuation of repression. I quoted my own president, President Mubarak, as saying, now Americans must learn from Egypt. All of a sudden, he wants Egypt to be a model for America to learn from on how to combat terrorism. Now America must stop reprimanding us for prolonging the implementation of the emergency laws. Egypt in 1981, when President Sadat was assassinated, did exactly what America did after 9/11. It passed some emergency laws, laws that enable the government to detain people without trial. Instead of 2 days, they made it 2 weeks. Instead of 2 weeks, they made it 2 weeks renewable 6 times. And now, 23 years after that episode, we still have the emergency laws. So the 2 weeks have become 2 months, 2 years, 2 decades. And we are into the 3rd decade of emergency laws. And that is what we had to warn our American hosts about, is that yes, it is understandable that you resort to some emergency measures in the immediate aftermath of a crisis or a horrific event like 9/11, but you must revise, and you must subject all of this to further periodic examination, and you must not continue these emergency measures. And we have to remind our American host and others of a famous saying, words of one of your founding fathers, of Benjamin Franklin, who forgot the exact occasion that prompted him to say the following phrase: those who sacrifice liberty for security deserve neither one. And with these words, I would end my remarks, and I hope that you will never sacrifice liberty for security. You must find the balance, and that is what we should all strive for. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ibrahim, for that wonderful talk and that wonderful panorama on how 9/11 has been refracted outside of the United States. We now have some time for questions and comments. Could I invite you to come to the mics and to please identify yourself, give both your name and your affiliation, and to keep your remarks as brief as possible so that everybody has a chance to ask a question. Yes, sir. I think that mic's not working, is it?
First of all, thank you. Thank you for your remarks. I enjoyed the speech. I have a question about an area that you didn't
Could you
address.
say your name? And
Oh, sorry. My name is David Edelman. I'm a senior at the college. I have a question about an area that you didn't address in your speech, but I'm sure is very important to you, which is Israel-Palestine conflict. To what extent do you think the other Arab leaders are concerned about really deep down the human rights of the Palestinians, in the sense that it seems like in the last, especially in the last few years, a lot more attention has been given to money from Arab countries going towards, and namely I'm talking about Saudi Arabia and Saddam Hussein, going towards suicide bombers and paying for their houses and that, as opposed to really pumping in money into the Palestinian economy, schools, roads, that kind of thing, to really improve the situation, regardless of what Israel does, just specifically towards the lives of Palestinians. Can you just comment on to what extent you think that's really a concern of theirs, and if there are ways that the U.S. or any other countries can sort of emphasize that as an important thing? Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Very important question. Let me say the following. The Arabs, the Muslims, have very legitimate grievances against the West. Grievances that start with the colonial age in the 19th century, all the way to Sykes-Picot, immediately after the First World War, in which our part of the world was fragmented, parceled, divided into states, some of which are very artificial. We are also victim of another Western grievance, the Balfour Declaration, that led to the current and the continuing tragedy in Palestine. All of these and the other grievances, I can go over the list, very legitimate grievances. These are historical accounts that must be settled. This is the first point. The second point, who are the legitimate accountants to settle these grievances? It is neither bin Laden, nor Hafiz al-Assad, nor Hamas, nor Mubarak. These are the wrong accountants. Who will settle them? Truly elected democracies. And this, I must invite you to think of the old 2nd-century proposition by Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher, who said that democracies do not go to war with each other. So tragic as the conflicts are in our part of the world, including the Palestinian conflict, the real legitimate forces that are qualified to settle that conflict are democratic forces, both inside Palestine and in neighboring Arab states. If the United States, if the West, if the Israelis are keen in settling that conflict peacefully, equitably, and they must, because any resolution of that conflict that's not equitable will not work. But nor will it work if dictators are the ones who are settling it, or if fanatics are the ones who are trying to settle it. And therefore, I prevail on all of you, especially American citizens in this room, to keep that in mind, to keep an interest in our part of the world. Because the continuation of the conflicts in our part of the world, in one way or another, drag Americans in. In the last 50 years, our part of the world, which represents only 7% of the world population, has appropriated notoriously 35% of the total world armed conflicts. In other words, we had appropriated 5 times as much as our demographic weight in the world. And here is the second shocking statistic. In those 50 years, America has used its armed forces 10 times. Do you know that? 10 times in 50 years in the Middle East? How many of you know that? How many of you have counted? None, probably. But from 1958, the first time that the Marines were sent to Lebanon, all the time when the Marines were resent to Iraq, 10 times. 10 times. That is to say, on the average of once every 5 years, American soldiers, planes, tanks are sent to our part of the world. And they will probably continue to go so long as the root causes of conflict are there, so long as the conflicts are not settled and they are flaring up every now and then, and America just gets involved in trying to put down fires instead of addressing the causes of the conflict. So that is what I prevail on you, and I'm glad you asked this question, Dave, because that is, in a democracy, that's what you have a responsibility. At least in our parts of the world, we don't have democracy, and we're fighting for it. And we could not hold our governments accountable. You can do that in your country, and you can prevail in your government to, yes, use whatever measures to secure your own interest, but also address real grievances and do so peacefully and equitably.
My name is Isa. I'm a student at Kennedy School. I'm Arab Palestinian. First, I'm delighted to see you here at the forum. And I've been here since the beginning of the academic year. And I've heard a lot talk about Arab and Muslims, Muslims and Arab in the forum for the last year. And this was the first time to see an Arab in Kennedy School forum. I would have liked the dean and his deputy to be here to welcome you. Anyhow, but this is a breakthrough. Someone like you, courageous, come to Kennedy School and speak. As we're having also difficulty in our area with the dictatorships and tyrant regimes, I feel here also, being here, that being an Arab in America or Muslim is not that easy at all. It's very difficult. And many times there is real misperceptions and misunderstanding to the Arab and Muslim culture, and even at the highest level, even in Washington or in Kennedy School. And I feel that, from our side, someone like Osama bin Laden or the extremists are dictating the agenda in the Arab and Muslim world, while here also those who declare Crusader War or the Holy War on Islam also dictating the agenda. And people, inside America or in the Arab world and Muslim world, and they are the majority, and they are the democratic forces, they are almost paralyzed. And what should be done? And I see that things are going more and more to the clashes of civilizations, and there are a lot of misperceptions. Something should be done. And what is the role of the liberal, democratic, intellectual Arab in the Arab world to bridge this gap?
Thank you, Isa. This is very important. And I empathize with your anguish and your sensitivity. And to me, as students, you are more important than any dean. So I'm glad you are here. I don't care if the dean is here, if the president is here. I would be delighted to have them. But it is. I'm here for the students, basically. I'm here for the younger generation. Especially, I'm delighted that there are some Arabs and some Muslims in the audience, because that is where my message must resonate. It is people like you who must go back and carry on the torch for democracy and justice in our part of the world. What can be done? Let me take the clue from Palestine, since you are a Palestinian. When the leaders on both sides, Arafat, Sharon, Barak, Mubarak, Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, failed in the year 2000 to reach an agreement after Camp David, after Taba. And as a result, the conflict restarted instead of the peace process going. Some, after the 3 years of the second intifada, some forces on the Palestinian and the Israeli side, civil society, liberal forces as you call them, got together and they worked out a peace accord called a virtual peace accord. These are people who are not in government. They were in government at one time, but now they are out in the opposition. Yasser Abdurrabbu on the Palestinian side, I'm sure you followed that, and Yossi Belan on the Israeli side. These are civil society forces at work. They got together. It wasn't easy, but they knew from the beginning that it will be very hard, and yet they persisted. Better hard, better protracted than shooting at each other. And they reached an accord, a Geneva peace accord. And they signed it late last year in Geneva, attended by nearly 50 former or present head of state. I don't know how many of you have followed this. Very important development, because it really points out to the direction we should all go. Do not wait for the governments. Do not wait for these dictators or the military-oriented people like Sharon. No, let us work as civil society, peace lovers, democracy advocates. Let us work and find solutions, and time will come where we can implement them. What they did after the Geneva, they mailed a copy of that accord to every Palestinian household, to every Israeli household, so people can read for themselves and make up their own minds. And 2 or 3 weeks later, they commissioned some public opinion polling agencies to ask people what they thought of the accord. And they got 57% endorsement on the Palestinian side, 54% on the Israeli side. This is the voice of the people. And the more we do that, the more we will prevail sooner or later. And that is what we should be all doing. I hope this answered in part your question. If we wait for dictators, if we wait for military-oriented rulers like Sharon, the conflict will just keep bleeding our people on both sides of the border. And therefore, I call on all peace lovers, all democracy forces, to, especially in America, again, and I'm asking you as Americans, ask your government to endorse, instead of endorsing Sharon's demands for continuing with the wall and for annexing blocks of settlements, they should, the President George Bush should have endorsed the Geneva Accord. Clinton did, Carter did, and maybe that's why he didn't. I don't know. But this is an opportunity. Instead of, encouraging military expansionism of Sharon, he and the administration here should give a push to the peace forces back home.
Hi, my name is Selma Hassan, and I'm a Sunni student here at the Kennedy School. Thank you so much, Dr. Saad, for coming to speak to us. My question was related to Egypt specifically, and I wanted to talk about the possibilities and opportunities for any democratic process in Egypt. And Egypt has always presented kind of quagmire for me because of the military history from Nasser to Sadat to Mubarak, and also because there's a fine line between what is the alternative to Hosni Mubarak, and the story goes that what is the alternative to Hosni Mubarak is the Islamic fundamentalists. Do you think that that's true? And how do you see a democratic process coming into play in Egypt at any time? Do you see any democratic forces coming in and taking the stage aside from the Muslim Brotherhood?
Thank you, Salma. Do you know that the second co-defendant in my case was a Sudanese? Did you know that? Nadia. There were 27 co-defendants with me, all associates at Ibn Khaldun. And the second principal in the case was a Sudanese lady like Salma. Her name is Nadia Abdul Noor. And she was also in prison, in women's prison. If we had time, I could have told you some very interesting, because you know, the courageous people in this case, my name was known, and the case became associated with my name. But there were some unknown soldiers, more heroic than I was. One of them was Nadia Abdul Noor, and the other one is my wife, Barbara Ibrahim, who is here sitting in front. Another. But back to your question, the prospect of democracy in Egypt, in Sudan, and all the Arab countries are about 50-50. And that is where the role of activists is. If you wait until things are completely ready, you will never get there. And what activists do is to take those 50% and make it 55%. Just like Yasser Abdurrabbu did, like UC Berlin did, is to mobilize people beyond an alternative and a better choice. And that's what we are doing. No, of course, Egypt had a liberal age, so did Iraq, by the way. Somebody asked me about Iraq. In the interwar period, between 1920 and 1958, Iraq has a pluralistic democracy. It wasn't perfect, but it was definitely better than Saddam Hussein and better than American occupation. So that is something to build on. The same thing happened in Egypt. The same thing in your country, Sudan. You had democratically elected governments. But these dictators come in through military coup d'etats and create a climate of emergency as if the country was in danger, and that's why they stepped in, and they make the situation worse. So we have to be ready to take over from them. And I assure you, there are people who are more qualified than Hosni Mubarak, than Omar al-Bashir, than Bashar al-Assad in these countries. Just give them chance. But they try to give the West an impression that if they go, it would be the Islamists who will take over. It will be the likes of bin Laden who will take over. That is a fear-arousing approach to frighten and to calm and to reduce the pressure on them to reform or to step down. That is not the case. I assure you that there are forces of civil society, of opposition, that can take over.
Doctor, my name is Charles Dunbar. I'm from Simmons College, and it's an honor to be with you this evening. My question really follows on the question of the lady from the Sudan. And it is essentially, a year ago I was in Yemen monitoring as an election monitor, and I had the privilege to be with an Egyptian human rights activist who was involved in this as well. This was right after, of course, the invasion and occupation of Iraq by the United States. And your fellow human rights activist, I think cannot recall his name, and that's probably just as well, made the very strong case that this event, and he was no fan of the occupation even then, I'm sure he would not have changed his views in light of what's happened in the last year, was that this would be a catalyst for democratic change in the Middle East. Now, I think he was not thinking of peaceful change, which is what you're thinking of, but thinking that people would begin to rise up. Indeed, he said that demonstrations that had been organized against the occupation, that people standing behind the front row in those demonstrations were not saying down with the US, they were saying down with Hosni Mubarak. Since then, I've tried to look for evidence of this in our popular press, and have found little, with the exception of a few articles on demonstrations in Syria. And I just wonder if you see in some way democracy being born from the forge and the fires that are the American occupation, and I would add also the latest developments in Israel and Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you. Very important question. And I am of the view, besides being an activist, I'm a social scientist and a student of social movements. And I recognize that every major world event, regional event, always creates waves, earthquakes, tremors that result in the birth of new orders. You, from the French Revolution on to the present time, you take all the great transformations, you'd find that they always followed great world events, some of which were tragic and violent. The 100-Year War, the 30-Year War, the War of the Roses, you know your history better than I do. And these were always events that resulted in the birth of new orders. I have no doubt that this will be the case. Even those of us who were against the war, if they just change the hat from being anti-war activists to being thoughtful social scientists, they will recognize the possibilities for change. And we're already seeing it. Yes, what the observation by this human rights activists who monitored the election with you is quite correct. Demonstrations will gather in Tahrir Square, that's the biggest square in Cairo, down with the United States 3 or 4 times, and then immediately down with Mubarak. Not whispering, but out loud. And that is why, with every demonstration in Tahrir Square, you found probably 2 or 3 times as many security forces as demonstrators, because they know that even if the declared objective of the demonstration is to protest an American action or an Israeli action, the second slogan that will be shouted is either asking for reform in Egypt or down with the regime. Yes.
I think nobody else should line up, so we'll just deal with these questions and then we'll bring the session to a close. Yes?
Marvin Brams, a one-time visiting scholar at the Harvard Divinity School. Last night, Richard Clark was here, sitting in the same seat, and someone had asked him about the Patriot Act, and he gave a surprising answer, and he said that most people will be surprised by my answer. He said, in general, he says, I've read it, I had some role in drafting it, and he says, I don't have a big problem with it. And he said, the reason is somewhat surprising. He said, unless we really have every option to protect ourselves against another attack, roughly equivalent to 9/11, he says, we will see an increased deterioration of civil liberties that far surpasses any threat to it by the Patriots Act, which I thought was an interesting view. I don't know if you have any view on the Patriots Act.
Well, I thought I did say that it should be readdressed, or should be, what is the word? Reviewed.
Yeah.
And that's what we said in the Atlanta Declaration. It should be reviewed every 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
And if there is no need for it, or if some of the draconian measures are no longer needed, they should be removed. Because yes, the threat to American democracy, civil liberty, is much greater. And for good or worse, what happens in America affects our life everywhere in the world.
Mm-hmm.
We wish it wasn't like that, but you being the superpower, the sole superpower, the strong, the rich, you have overreach, you are, everywhere. Yes, whatever happens here affects us. And therefore we have an interest in ending these draconian measures not only because it affects American civil liberty, but because it also echoes negatively back home. And it also affects some of our brothers and sisters who are living here in this country. I see some of them in front of me here.
Yeah.
And of course, they are impacted. Their life has become more difficult, either metaphorically or literally. They are, everywhere they go, they are questioned. I know my wife and I, just because we have the last name Ibrahim inside this country. Here I am out of Mubarak's prison, but I'm questioned in many airports. I am delayed, detained. I missed my planes. Last week we were going to see my mother-in-law in Indiana. We missed our plane because of the Patriot Act, because they have to check on us. And they took longer than usual, 2 hours, the plane left. So everybody suffers as a result of this.
Yeah.
Of course, you can put up with it for a while, but in no way it should be left unchecked, unreviewed by good, thoughtful American people.
I think you've indicated why many people are sort of unsatisfied with his response, which sounded like really nothing to worry about. That's why people were sort of surprised by his answer, because he's usually a rather thoughtful, insightful person. But I think your response indicates why we really should be very careful about monitoring it and reviewing it and really seeing it as something temporary.
Right.
Yeah.
You don't want it to last for 23 years like it did with us.
Yeah.
Our emergency laws, which were understandably enacted after the assassination of President Sadat, are still with us.
Yeah.
And that is where the disaster could lie.
Thank you.
Thank you. So,
I also would like to thank you for your very interesting presentation. My name is Herman Soot. I'm with the medical school, but I would like to ask you if you could comment on the impact on Arab opinion and reaction to the United States by the apparently extensive expansion of our military bases in that region. And I refer to the fact that we are establishing bases in Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and other places which have large Muslim populations. And according to what I've read, we have plans for major long-term military establishments in Iraq, and of course we have them in other parts. And I would like to know how much negative reaction there is amongst Muslims or Arabs to this expanding military presence.
There's a lot of concern and tremendous voices of protest of this return of Western hegemony. Americans are not so much distinguished from other Westerners. So it is the West coming back. And we thought we liberated ourselves, we became independent, only to discover some 20, 30 years later, partly because it's the fault of our rulers, partly because of the Cold War, partly because of hegemonic designs, partly because the reincarnation of American new conservative imperialist, whatever the design is, that is of great concern to us. Having said that, however, I must address something that is so popular nowadays. Why do they hate us? Why does the world hate us? I assure you that America and Americans are not hated. What is hated are two things. One, American foreign policy, American arrogance, and the new conservatives in Washington. That is really what is hated. On balance, America is very popular. American education, American business, American know-how. You go to any capital in the Middle East, in the Muslim world, see the lines in front of the American embassy, vis-a-vis the lines in front of any other embassy. Those who want to come to America for education, for medical treatment, for recreation, for business, are more than anybody who's going anywhere else in the world. This is one. Another interesting indicator, if you take the Middle East alone, the number of American universities. I teach in one of them. It's called the American University in Cairo. And for the last 100 years, we had 2 American universities, one in Cairo and one in Beirut, AUB and AUC. In the last 3 years, the number of American universities tripled. After 9/11, this is very important. So despite this very strong emotion here and there, the fact that American way of life, American education is highly appreciated must not be overlooked. And there is now a new American university in Kuwait, one in Sharqa, and one in Dubai, and one in Qatar. 4 more. It used to be 2, now there are 6.
Thank you very much. We have not much time left, so I'll ask both of you to ask your question one after the other, and then we'd ask Professor Ibrahim to reply to both of you.
Kirk Beatty from Simmons College. I also am honored to be in your presence and very pleased to see you once again.
How are you?
Fine, thank you. Tamam. You spoke about how the Muslim activists in prison and yourself and other members of your group came together and found a certain measure of value congruence along democratic lines. Could you tell us to what extent that has happened in civil society? How much distance has been traveled by the various representatives of the major political currents, opposition currents, overcoming the deep chasms that have separated them in the past?
Can we take both questions together? Just
All right,
yes,
sure.
Dr. Saaduddin Ibrahim, Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
In case you may be wondering where we have met before, it was last December in Athens, at the Middle East think tank democratic group.
So your face smiling, and I was wondering where I have seen that smiley face before. Yes.
I was thinking about democracy together in the Middle East.
Right.
Now my question will be linked to that. You talk about Middle East regimes as dictatorships. Would you put all the 22 members of the Arab League in the same basket? Second question. Normally when we think about democracy, we think in terms of political democracy, separation of powers, expressions of freedom, multi-party systems. Now, even those conditions are not met correctly by most regimes. Now, the Americans came up a little more than 1 year ago with a new modern definition of democracy for the Middle East. That's the Rick Haas presentation in 8 elements in which political democracy is just one aspect. Now, within this new criteria related to gender issue, related to introducing critical thinking in education, related to economic, many new criteria. How would you appreciate them towards the Middle East? Mostly that we know that when Mitterrand in France brought his definition of democracy to Africa in La Baule, we know what the results were. What would the results to you in the Middle East be if these were kept at this high barrier? And thank you again for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. First, to the different forces in my society, let's say in Egypt, beside the Islamists in prisons who have made 180 degrees revision of their thoughts and practices. And there is always suspicion whether they are doing that tactically or whether they really believe in what they are espousing now verbally and in writing. We don't know. Only experience will show. And we have to remain vigilant. But again, as a social scientist, what matters is behavior, not intentions, because we don't want to be into the practice of inquisition. I suffered as a result of inquisition. Many innocent people suffered from trial of intentions, trials of conscience. You cannot try conscience or intention, you try behavior. Fine. Some of the elders of these Islamists in prison, when I got out, they contacted me and they said, we are aware of what was going on in prison and we'd like to continue the dialogue outside prison. So we continued the dialogue for a while. And then they said, now we want to meet Westerners directly, without a mediator, without any in-between. So I talked to some of the ambassadors in Cairo who used to frequent me in prison, to come and see me in prison, and who were aware of the dialogue. And I said, now the elders of these Islamic movements or groups would like to have a dialogue with you face to face. So 4 or 5 of them, 5 actually, agreed to do so. And so we held a number of sessions where they began this dialogue. More importantly, or to complement that, over the year that passed since I had been out of prison, I was acquitted in March last year. Over this year, so many things happened. Not only the war in Iraq, but also many things happened, including on the internal front in every Arab country, in Libya, in Syria, in Morocco. And that would bring me to the second question. In many of these countries, there have been developments, not grabbing headlines, but very important developments for a social scientist who is keen on observing the thick trends of change. And I'll talk about some of those very briefly later on. But staying with your question, John, the Muslim Brothers, publicly, and the Muslim Brothers is the mother of all Islamic movements. This is the oldest, the most important Islamic movement in the entire Muslim world, from Indonesia to Morocco. A movement started back in 1928. That movement, the new leader of the movement, who became a supreme guide last February, on March 13, he held a press conference in the press syndicate in the heart of Cairo to declare the movement's total endorsement of Western-type democracy. And he emphasized Western because in the past, oh yes, we are Democrats, but not Western type. Fine. This guy didn't want to leave any doubt about their new commitment, declared commitment to democracy. You know who was very angry at that? The regime, Hosni Mubarak. Why? Because with that declared commitment by the Muslim Brothers, in fact, the regime lost one of the cards, always frightening the West and the Egyptian middle class and the Egyptian Copts of the Islamists. Now the Islamists are saying, we not only believe, but we commit ourselves to democracy, and we pledge to respect the rules of the game, and we are like our brothers in Turkey who ran for election and who won the election and formed the government, and even though an Islamic based, but here is the government, and it was not the end of the world. So he basically was making the same plea. Marxists have come around to also a commitment to democracy. So everyone is committed to democracy now. We are just waiting for our president to join and hope with them. For my Moroccan brother, is that correct, Morocco? Yes. No, not all the Arab countries should be thrown in the same bag. Some are more democratic than others, including your own, Morocco. Morocco has come a long way. And speaking of other criteria of democracy besides election, the king of Morocco, King Mohamed VI, made two great steps late last year. One of them is to send to his parliament a draft bill that provides for complete gender equality. This is a social revolution. Gender equality in all aspects: inheritance, marriage, divorce, children custody, everything. This is a revolution. Very, to me, far more important than anything else, that bill. The second is that he decreed the establishment of a commission called the Commission for Truth and Fairness, modeled after Mandela's South African Commission for Truth and Reconciliation, in order to investigate all the violations committed during his father's reign, during the rule of Hassan II. Now, that is also very important. There are other kings who have done some very progressive, and this is ironic, because 30 years ago when I was a student here in America, I never thought that these kings are good for anything. We used to shout and yell, end of these monarchies, and so on. Little did I know that I would live to see monarchs are leading the change, and it is our revolutionary Republican presidents who are resisting change. See what could happen in 30 years or 40 years. So we have a king in Bahrain who is as progressive. We have the Emir of Qatar, who is very progressive. We have the Sultan of Oman, who has moved his country. We have the King of Jordan. These, what is common among them? I was asked that in MIT earlier today. What's common among these kings? One, they are younger, all in their 30s or 40s. Two, they are all modern educated. Some were educated in England, Sandhurst, in Oxford. Some were educated in the Sorbonne. And it is this combination of being young and educated that made them more tuned to what's happening in the world and more responsive to the demands of their people. So, no, not all the Arab countries are equally dictatorial or equally despotic. Some are less so than others.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.